So we are so excited to have Bill Domhoff here. I have to say that you are legendary, and when we heard that you were going to be here, some people even brought their books for you to sign afterwards. So we are very excited to have you speak. Bill, of course, is an author for Who Rules America? The Triumph of the Corporate Rich. He's a distinguished professor emeritus, a research professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and he's building on our conference theme of a legacy of sociology. His speech will be Who Rules America and Power Structure Research, Legacies of the 60s or Relics. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you so much, Thea. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy the opportunity to tell the story of power structure research from its origins in the 50s to the present. And especially the theme of the conference is ideal. I would love it for power structure research to be a legacy for sociology, having put 54 years of my own into it. But I always think it's on the verge of being a relic, and that will be the theme of my talk. So by power structure research, I mean the kind of work you find in Floyd Hunter's Top Leadership USA in 1959, or his Community Power Structure in 53, or C. Wright Mills' The Power Elite, various editions of Who Rules America from 67 to 2014, and also these books depend on many very fine sociologists and some great work they've done, and some political scientists as well. And there's now a rising younger generation, small but excellent, doing this kind of research. And I do think that power structure research has made a great many contributions in understanding the American power structure. It's mapped the structure, the framework, the networks, the ongoing institutions of the overall power structure at both the national and the local levels. It's shown how this particular power structure operates, the processes within it, how it works its will, how it gets its way in seeming small ways and on very large pieces of legislation, such as was passed in the New Deal, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Social Security Act, and even the National Labor Relations Act as far as its origins, except that that particular act got away from the power structure and was put to its own uses, changed by liberals and labor, and it was useful to everyday Americans for the next 40 years at least. And finally, the field of power structure research has been able to trace and explain the considerable change that's always occurring and that occurred between 1935 and the present. But, as I already implied, despite all that success, it's always in danger of marginalization, of becoming a relic, not a legacy. And how could that be? That's the first kind of topic I want to address. Now, there's no doubt several reasons. It's a very long and complex story, so I only want to highlight it here. But I first of all want to say that power structure research does not quite fit with either the two great the narratives of Western history about progress and eventual human harmony and happiness, equality, and so on. I'm referring to liberalism, talks about gradual changes, more democracy, more equality. It's spoken of in sociology in terms of, and other social scientists in terms of volunteer groups, interest groups, political parties. In a word, in the social sciences, it's pluralism. Everybody's part of it. We're pulling, yes, some have more power, but it's going in that positive kind of direction. And there's another great narrative of social change and eventual success, and it's embodied in Marxism. Even though there's growing crises and things are going to get worse for a while, there will be an inevitable class struggle, but in the end there will be a very fine outcome called socialism, sharing equality, and so on. Power structure research is uneasy within that context. It's a study of power that's rooted in organization. It's pluralism, liberalism, voluntary associations. They don't come first, nor does class and class struggle always be the privileged factors in social change. So yes, organizations are a power base, is what my emphasis is. It is true, as organizational theorists tend to emphasize, that they are functional, they are efficient, they have tremendous advantages. But from a human point of view and a power structure point of view, it's not all peachy keen. Because in fact, these organizations can be turned into power bases. The people on the top can move people around, they put their friends in place, they can reward their friends on the outside, they can self-indulge, and all of these kinds of things then lead to power structures. And there's a constant vigilance to keep a power structure at all accountable, and the future is very uncertain in that context. Power structure research is also, as you're going to experience for many of you in your further education and maybe in graduate education, it fits a little uncomfortably in terms of our methodological pigeonholes. Because, in fact, power structure researchers can't just go out and do surveys. They can't do more structured kind of interviews. I would characterize power structure research as often very opportunistic. Takes advantage of an accident, of a scandal, of a leak. It has to, every once in a while, get a hold of papers. Somebody else purloined them, of course. But you get amazing papers from these organizations that are then quite revealing about them, and usually just about the opposite of what they claim about themselves. And there's a certain unseemliness of having a deep throat, an informant from the higher levels, and to be relying on these insider kinds of people. It seems, in a word, much too like investigative journalism somehow, and it doesn't fit our image. Well, what's the evidence? Why would I think that? I'm just imagining it. And I would just like to very briefly tell you the fate of these people I mentioned earlier, Floyd Hunter and C. Wright Mills. Hunter was amazing. He had worked in a social agency in Atlanta, and then he started just going around asking people who's powerful, a method that got called the reputational method, because that's only a reputation for power. Hunter called it the take me to your leader method. He landed on an island and met somebody and said, would you take me to your leader? So he asked a lot of people, would you tell me who your leaders are? And you know what? Within 3 or 4 rounds of asking those questions, you do know the leaders. It was very successful. It was applied by a lot of sociologists that are now history. They aren't in the legacy. Very successfully at the local level. Hunter applied it at the national level in a book called Top Leadership USA. What made a believer, so to speak, out of me was when I did my kind of research, it had a big overlap with his kind of list. And yet, he was so heavily criticized for this method that most of you probably have never heard of him. He's not in the textbooks. And even when people went back to Atlanta and did further studies, thanks to political sociologists and political science, but even more recent archival findings, you know, when you go in the people's papers 30 years later, he's been like totally vindicated. But he is not back in the legacies of sociology. And the same thing, what about Mills? Everyone has heard about Mills. Everyone probably at least read parts of excerpts of the Sociological Imagination, for instance. But by 1980, as I'm going to explain to you, his book called Power League was never cited by the social scientists that I'm going to talk about. And he would have been soon forgotten, I think, except if we're not for the social movements that began in the 1960s, because they created the openings for power structure research within the academy. The SNCC and SDS had their own research for their own reasons. Remember a pamphlet called The Care and Feeding of Power Structures. And shortly after that, as part of the mobilization on campuses, by 1968, there was a pamphlet called Who Rules Columbia, partly based on documents after a sit-in that they'd gotten from the president's office. Go to school and learn to rule. That was about Yale University and its rule. How Harvard rules, all these pamphlets. So Hunter plus Mills plus these movement researchers made a book like Who Rules America possible and relevant. And it got read and reviewed and otherwise would not have. Who Rules America combined what I call social indicators with power indicators, and then looked in standard research available sources, reference sources. Social indicators means upper class standing. Did you go to certain prep schools? Are you in certain social clubs? Did you go to certain exclusive resorts? Debutante ball lists, and so on. Power indicators, that's wealth and income distribution, overrepresentation in organizations. And let me tell you about power indicators in an inverse way. What if I said to you that 50% of the population is women and only 1% of the leaders are women? Does that tell us anything, perhaps? If 10% of the population are African Americans and 0% of these people are in positions of power, does that tell us anything? Well, that's rhetorical, of course, but the point is, if 0.5% of the population are in the upper class, and if they have 30% of the wealth and 30% of the corporate leadership seats, and that's all in the past, that, I think, tells us something. Many pluralists did not agree. So the results of the early mapping that we did are shown in the first graphic. You see a picture of it's a Venn diagram, it's called. You got a social upper class, you've got a corporate community, and you got a policy planning network, and they'll be understood as I unfold. And drawn from those networks is a power elite. So we have on the one hand, sure, there's people in the upper class that just ride their horse and go to parties and take jets everywhere. Sure, in the corporate community we have rising executives, we have vice presidents, and sure, in the policy planning network, as we'll see, we have hired experts. But the boards of directors, the boards of trustees of all these organizations, profit and non-profit, are comprised of the power elite. And at the end, I will even make a guesstimate of its size just to be provocative. And by 1970, we had a good idea, as in graphic 2, we had a good idea of how the big policies were made. I call that the policy planning network. In particular, there are policy discussion groups. And these groups provide a setting in which these corporate leaders have an ongoing seminar where they go once a month and hear from experts about what's going on in China, or if they're in a study group on trade, they go to those meetings. And these meetings also provide a forum where business guys can argue and discuss and iron out their differences. And they're an informal training ground for new leadership. Hey, Joe from St. Joe's paper, he really gets along well with experts. He seems to bring discussions together well. It's the kind of thing you see in your own organizational setting. And in addition, they say these groups have three roles in terms of the rest of us, the society. Now, they legitimate their members as serious people who go to nonpartisan, nonprofit meetings on their own time, just to know about foreign policy. In these organizations, the young experts that go there soon learn what would be good to study to get grants. These guys also sit on foundation boards, the big guys that I'm talking about here. They were mostly big guys in the past, and some women now, but not a whole lot. And then they constantly have an output of books, journals, policy statements. They put op-eds in the New York Times and Washington Post, so they contribute to the climate of opinion. Well, by 1970, we could put all of this into the network you see in the next graphic, namely the Policy Planning Network. And, you know, it's not the time to sort of study that, kind of a Rube Goldberg-like diagram. But the point is that we could map it, and then you could see, okay, new policy. Let's see if we can fit it into these organizations. Now later we made that graphic a little easier to adapt, to decipher, and that's the next graphic. And you can see how it works, and very clearly. And may I say that recently sociologists have done books and articles that say, hey, this really works for environmental policies. It also works for the whole movement to create more and more charter schools. Now by 1974, we could spell out the connections, the detailed set of networks between the upper class corporate community kind of network and the government. And there's 4 overlapping but distinct processes. And they take us from the very specific to the very general. Again, without details, there's a special interest process, very narrow interest. This is lobbying. This is trying to jimmy the regulatory agency. This is trying to get in good with the committee that's writing the legislation. The policy planning process, that's what I've already mentioned. That's where the people get together, discuss, come out with these policy statements, and they move towards government. We also differentiated out at that point an opinion-shaping network. It attempts, though. Americans have their own views, and they don't get changed by these efforts by these people. But they're very general views. They usually don't involve specific legislation. People aren't following that closely. They have their lives to lead. They're stem to stern for their day and keeping up with their job, their family, their loved ones, their interests. But in that context, the policy planning network is expert at creating doubt about other views. They do present alternatives, and they certainly ridicule opponents through the policy, the opinion-shaping network. They spy on, for interest, animal rights activists. They infiltrate their organizations through these cutout organizations, these organizations they're financing indirectly. And finally, there is a candidate selection process. That's how we bring the 2 political parties into the whole scene. It's in part large campaign finance donations to both parties, but it's also involves many of these experts and lobbyists working in people's campaign. And at that point, we did differentiate out a specific version of the opinion-shaping network, which is in a graphic there, showing just how they reach both what's called the attentive public, the 5 or 6% that are maybe paying attention, and the more general public. There are little different avenues on that. This research, which did have a lot of interest in the upper class as a social class, remember I talked about social indicators, that wasn't ignored all of a sudden in the 1970s. We were always looking for opportunities to study these social groups, and I got a great opportunity accidentally through interviewing a person about his campaign finance donations, and he was a very liberal guy, but he was in a club called the Bohemian Club, north of San Francisco, and they're in San Francisco, but they have a retreat called the Bohemian Grove on the Russian River, 75 miles or so north of San Francisco. Most people haven't heard of it unless they've lived in that area. But the point is, we were able to study that in great depth through having their old records, plus informants, and including students that had worked there. So everybody I saw when I was working on this project, they said, what are you up to? I said, I'm studying the Bohemian Grove. You ever heard of it? And some people, I don't think so, but I think my friend may have maybe worked there. Can I meet your friend? Yeah. And so I had some great interviews with these people. And the punchline of studying these social groups is from small group research in social psychology in the 1950s, in departments, incidentally, that had social psychology that were sociologically oriented and psychologically oriented in the same department, like at University of Michigan. That's all gone. But the point is that these people showed through little small group experiments that their physical proximity leads people to get to know each other. They know that the more people interact, the more they tend to like each other. If a group's seen as high status and you're joining it, oh boy, you feel tighter with those members than you otherwise would. And a relaxed setting is best, as opposed to a tense problem-solving setting in terms of people getting to know and like each other. So the punchline is social cohesion facilitates policy cohesion, makes it possible to create policy cohesion. Well, all that's still pretty vague, right? At least for most social scientists. So in a special issue of the Insurgent Sociologist, you can imagine what that journal was like. But we had a special issue on power structure research, and we put in some of the cutting edge stuff, including a great account by a woman who worked for one of these activist organizations, and they had just happened to get their hands on the minutes of meetings of big business with the Defense Department, and she wrote a great article for that particular issue. Never went into academia. She was always an activist. She was always, as she told me, more interested in convictions than theories. That is, let's nail these guys and put them in jail, was her interest. But in any case, in that issue, we did a more quantitative study where we mixed together the members of 30 organizations, social clubs and policy groups. And we used a measure for what's called centrality, who's in more the center in that network in terms of organization. And lo and behold, there's an organization called the Business Council, which was a precursor of something you may have heard of called the Business Roundtable. Another one of these policy discussion groups called the Committee for Economic Development. Then a club in New York called the Links Club, which is known as the corporate rendezvous of the American upper class, because if you're anybody in the corporate world, you go to New York on business, you're probably going to stay at the Links Club or certainly have lunch there or maybe go out to their golf course. You see the Council on Foreign Relations, that's where most of our State Department appointees come from. And I see lots of other clubs like the Pacific Union in San Francisco. And this Bohemian Club, lo and behold, only number 11 in that particular thing. But you notice, hey, I haven't brought in any corporations yet into that network. What about specific corporations in relation to all of this? Well, we published the answer to that question in 1983 in another special issue of a journal, this time called Social Science History. It traced the history of corporate networks from 1820, mind you, on into 1970s. And one of the articles in there was by, thanks to my great undergraduate research assistant of that time, a man named Hal Salzman, who went on to earn his PhD at Brandeis in sociology and to study power in the workplace, micro power, including in the high-tech industries. And he now is in a policy school at Rutgers, so I just tell you that because there is life after undergraduate school. Just go one step at a time. So in the next graphic, you see what Hal and I found. And in this network, I had about 100 corporations. We also had several think tanks, policy groups, and cultural groups of various kinds, and universities. This is for the year 1970. And at the top, you see the top 25. There's IBM, then one of these policy groups, the Conference Board, then General Foods, and then a bank that's now been absorbed into J.P. Morgan Chase called Chemical Bank, another one of these policy groups, then New York Life Insurance, then Yale University, and so on, down the list. And you can also see that the rankings for types of groups on this graphic. And so you can see, for instance, under universities that MIT was the 24th in these 200 and some organizations, that Harvard was 50th, and so on. You can see something called the Rockefeller Foundation was 10th, and Ford Foundation, which is a big deal, was 69th. So you get a certain sense of the network. Now, way down at the bottom right-hand corner, you see something where it says the National Association of Manufacturers, 196th. Well, that's an organization of business that would plural should say, well, that's the key business organization. No, it isn't. And we've known that since the 70s. But when they talk about business, they mean the National Association of Manufacturers. But that was the 1970, right? What about now? I mean, that's ancient history. Well, we have a 2011 database that thanks to a sociologist, University of North Dakota, Cliff Staples, hooray for Cliff, and he and I then made it a little more copacetic, and it's a detailed database. It's on whorulеsamerica.net, and anyone's welcome to a copy. We're glad to share it. It's got 2,500 plus corporations, 82 major foundations, 33 think tanks, 6 policy groups. There's also, so you can check if you want to do the study, how those groups relate to private universities, 47 of them, 19 White House advisory groups. All that's there for future research. So here I'm just going to highlight some findings on a quick series of graphics to give you a sense of it. You're going to see it's the same kind of result. So, and I also should begin by saying what you're going to see is a tour of what we call fictive space, fictional space, where the closeness of people who could be on other side of the country but talk every day or see each other's meeting, but they're shown in a geographic way. In other words, the more they interact, so to speak, the more boards on there together, the closer they are in this geographic space. And so I started with a think tank called the Brookings Institution, very famous from the past. All you see is a blur of lines and little squares. But the point is, it's a mix of corporations and organizations from the Policy Planning Network. You can sort of see that Boeing is in there, that Travelers Insurance is in there. But we can also go in there and zero in on a little closer, right? And so we see the Brookings Institution on the next graphic in bigger form. We see it's real close to Business Roundtable. We see Boeing, we see Travelers, we see the University of Southern California. Their trustees are not small potatoes in the corporate world. We can also see it up close for another group that wasn't on our 1970 radar because it was very small, but it grew from the 70s on. It's called the American Enterprise Institute. It's a more conservative group. We call it an ultra-conservative group. It's the new kid on a block, historically speaking, but there it is, right in the heart of the network in 2011, right close to the Business Council, close to the Business Roundtable. You'll see Caterpillar Tractor, and so on. So there they are, moved into the network. We tossed in one university for today, and that's Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Of course, MIT is very important in terms of technological expertise, scientific advice, and so on. So the trustees of the University of Massachusetts are also the kind of people, or are also the people, I should say, who sit on Brookings Institution, the Council on Foreign Relations, IBM, Business Roundtable, Business Council. Now finally, in terms of this whirlwind trip through the graphics, and that's why, of course, they're on a handout, so you can look at it later, is that what if we just look at those policy groups I mentioned and see how many overlapping members they have? What do we come up with in terms of a network? And what we see is that this Business Roundtable and Business Council are in the center. And they are, their size, their importance is shown through the bigger circle. That's a degree of importance and effect, or a degree of connection. And so the point then is, this Business Council, to tell you, is really an informal version of the Business Roundtable. They meet informally in the White House. They meet informally in a resort area called Hot Springs, Virginia, I think it is. And but the Business Roundtable is all business. It's straight ahead. It puts out position papers, and its CEOs go out and lobby, and so on. The other difference between the two is if you're in the Business Council and you retire as a CEO, you stay on the Business Council. If you retire as a CEO of a company and you were on the Business Roundtable, you leave the Business Roundtable. So there's a way in which the Business Council, a little bit, the sages, and the Business Roundtable is the one that's in action. It's metaphorically very significant that Committee for Economic Development is on the left, It's a little more moderate than the others. Chamber of Commerce is much more right-wing. And coming back to that National Association of Manufacturers, you see it up at the right-hand corner. It's small, and it is way to the right. And you see on the top a thing called the Conference Board. I haven't mentioned before. It's much more neutral. It's a place to hold meetings. They put out statistical reports and so on. So it's not really as much of a policy discussion group. Okay, so we've shown all that. And so I'd like now, by it's still the same in 2011. So now I'd like to go back to the future. That is, put us back in the late 70s and early 80s. And at that point, I gotta admit, I thought that power structure was on a roll. Power structure research, it was really making it. Books, special issues of journals, at least a dozen or more active researchers. But I was wrong. Which is not the first time I've been wrong, because since then, it was, at that time period was really sort of the beginning of marginalization and of power structure research and of dwindling number of power structure research. And at this point, it's all but disappeared from political sociology and from intro sociology kind of text. So what happened? Two kinds of things. Two things. One will be, I'll talk about under the rubric of structural Marxism, and the other historical institutionalism. Now, as to Marxism, the Marxist version that was ascendant in the 70s in a reassertive kind of way, it was a new generation of Marxists. They were just out of grad schools. They were led by one elder, though, who came in line in the late 50s and 60s, a famous economist of the era named James O'Connor, wrote a book called The Fiscal Crisis of the State. And basically they said that power structure research was superficial. It was supposedly on the personal level. It was just about a bunch of people, which you've seen how I've used a bunch of people, and names and all that kind of stuff. Trace ties of individuals. And that was seen as, you know, very low level kind of stuff. But of course there was really two levels. There was individual level and organizational level. You can't create those networks without the both. And there's a great name for it. It's called a membership network analysis. And membership's the key word there because it implies individuals who are members. It also applies if there's membership, there must be something you are a member of that is an entity. So, of course, it had people and organizations. It was what came to be called a two-network, hypermodal network, and so on. Some very fancy names in network analysis. But as for what this particular generation of Marxists advocated, they said the issue was structure. And they called themselves structural Marxists, the word I used earlier. And specifically, it was the nature of capitalism that mattered and the structure of the economy that mattered. And so studying the Bohemian Grove policy, cohesion is facilitated by social cohesion. No, what are you guys wasting your time on that kind of stuff for? It's all much more structural. It moves, you know, at a much higher kind of level. And as they saw it, capitalism was in a deep crisis at that time. It could only survive by using the government more. It was called the state at that time, to save capitalism. Furthermore, there was a new moral economy developing in the rest of us from below that was going to force the issue anyhow and lead to a stronger welfare state. Here, what do I mean? I mean unionized workers, there was still such a thing. I mean the elderly, because they were quite organized. That's what they meant too, I should say. It meant activists in movements, including African Americans who were organizing around issues of welfare rights and minimum income maintenance and so on. Well, basically the irony is that the Reagan-Bush 1 era, George W. Bush as president, just to recall, was also the president after Reagan. So from 80 to 92 should not have happened. It could not have happened. But that didn't stop them because when you're in the middle of something, you don't see that you're in the middle of a sea change, except tracing who the people were and which organizations they came from. Power structure research said, wow, we're in the middle of a transition. And we wrote about it, but it was to no avail. So within a few years, though, most of the structural Marxists had disappeared. Some had switched to topics, other topics to study, and I won't name examples or name. Others drifted into neoliberal theory. Some even became pluralists. One person in particular who studied cities, and he just became a straight-out pluralist and never spoke of the past. And I would try to get him to say, why'd you change your mind? They would not speak of why they changed their mind. But one of the, now we turn to a couple of people that had stayed the course. That is, that they had stayed with their views, but in the early 2000s, they said what the problem was, as you see on one of the graphics, and that is James O'Connor. He had said, well, we failed to anticipate the rise of neoliberalism and globalization and the reestablishment of U.S. political hegemony after the fall of the Soviet Union. In parentheses, you see what is my rhetorical question, but it's a serious statement. Can we ever really predict the future, given the complexity of the equation that we are dealing with? And if we can't, then we can't have the kind of certainty that there's going to be decline or there's going to be this or crisis that is claimed by some of these theorists. In 2004, in a book that I could heartily recommend to you, has several authors, it's called Enriching the Sociological Imagination, in which a lot of different authors that appeared in the Insurgent Sociologists wrote a reflection on their particular article in the Insurgent Sociologists. And to his great credit, one of the people who was most prominent at that time and still is in sociology, Eric Olin Wright, at the University of Wisconsin, still a Marxist as far as I know, he wrote a very fine statement on this that tells you what was going on at the time, which we can see in reflection. He said one of the tacit assumptions in much Marxist work in the early 70s was the conviction that the statist turn, the turn to needing the state, in capitalism could not be dramatically reversed, which meant that no one seriously envisioned the wholesale dismantling of the welfare state, the deregulation of Marxist Freudian slip, the markets, and the partial reversal of statist capitalism as a way of coping with crisis tendencies. So that structural Marxism kind of disappeared or was not a major player within 10 years. But there was a second major criticism, the marginalization effect on power structure research. And that was the work of a then sociologist named Theda Skocpol. And there are many, many students, most of whom are political scientists in major universities, advocating the view that she and they developed. And they put a great emphasis on institutions. And they began their whole thing by saying, in an article that Skocpol wrote called Neo-Marxist Theories of the State. And in that, what she did with power structure research was to call us Marxists. And so this simple-minded version, power structure research in the hands of the structural Marxists, was now Marxism in the hands of Skocpol. And so we had this simple-minded view. And then there was a more elegant view, which was the structural Marxists, but they weren't quite right either. And so what we need is her view, which did not involve Marxism. But in any case, they went forward, they studied a lot of different legislative kind of programs, but I don't think that they had it very right. And by the 1992, Skocpol was now fully in political science. She then wrote something in which she basically became a pluralist. And once again, you can read that quote, where she said that the lack of bureaucracies, that is, after all, there isn't a very strong state like she claimed there was, the lack of bureaucracies provides ample opportunity for voluntary associations, that's a pluralist word, and necessitates the creation of broad transpartisan coalitions, that's also a pluralist concept, and ultimately legislators that have to be assembled for each particular issue, which is classic pluralism. So I rhetorically ask, does this sound like pluralism? And it does to me. So what her great accomplishment was that she had smited the Marxists. She was fully finished them off, and at the same time, she had returned us to a version of pluralism that now exists. So in any case, that's what did us in the most. But I want to close very quickly by saying another ironic kind of thing has been the big deal in the last 10, 15 years. Organizational theorists, mostly in business schools, but some in sociology, were very concerned to try to figure out why there would be interlocking directorates. And it wasn't enough that there were such and that they created a social cohesion. There had to be more to it. And so they went to a theory that might still be around, that you might still be taught, called resource dependency theory, which simply says that various things that are done by organizations are a way of decreasing their dependencies, making it so there's more certainty, whether it's supplies or relation to government or whatever it may be. So they said interlocking directorates are a strategy for decreasing a firm's dependency. Well, that's testable, and it certainly got more muscle to it than just social cohesion, right? And famous sociologists, Marxist sociologists at the time, Mark Mizrachi, who did some great early work on networks, and how they changed over the 20th century, he thought resource dependency theory fit with Marxism. And so he said, I developed this theoretical argument in which I tried to synthesize the social class model and the resource dependence model. He liked it, first of all, because it legitimated the study of interlocks, the search for legitimacy within the mainstream. But he said, secondly, that he liked it because it tied it to structural forces and it was consistent with Marxism. Now, this view was then faced with some devastating empirical findings. One is, you would expect if there was a relationship that was important between two corporations, and the guy dies or retires, it was still all guys then, they'd be replaced, right? And 2 or 3 studies were done, and you looked at what were called broken ties. They weren't replaced with somebody from the same organization or even the same cluster of organizations. In fact, their social clubs predicted better who was going to be appointed to these positions. So at any rate, by 2017, 2 network researchers looking back said resource dependency theory seemed of little use to explain corporate interlock. So that put them back at square one. And in terms of rethinking, one of these people, a business school organizational theorist, he decided that corporate networks should be understood as small world networks. Now, a small world network is a fancy term for a unique kind of network. It's not a random network, but it has a lot of small, close ties in it, a few large paths, and certain clusters, just like you saw a lot of these clusters already. And small world networks then have really good, basically they're really fast and good in communication. And lo and behold, in writing about this in 2002, this person even stated that it was Mills, mind you, C. Wright Mills, that understood that corporate network was more or less an unintended consequence. So he wrote, in contrast, others, that means Mills we're going to get to, emphasize the unplanned nature of the network. Members of the corporate elite all seem to know each other as an unintended consequence of increasing economic concentration. And he cites Mills. So they then draw a conclusion that says that the upshot of these studies is that board interlocks they're a fortuitous product. But they then provide this great network of people that know their stuff, that can pass information. And it's just like social networks, he said. So that made it, in other words, so we're back to social cohesion. Well, then they found a new problem. The same person, by 2016, said this was all dead. It was all dead because he and his student claimed that the network was much less dense, sparse it's called, and that means there's fewer connections within the network. Well, now I'm back to the first part of my remarks and coming close to the end of my remarks, and that is to say what you saw here with that 2011 network is a huge network that has in it 2,500 plus organizations, I've already said, but it also has in it exactly 9,121 individuals are in that network. And the amazing thing is that 35% of those 9,121 people, that's all the people that sit on any of the boards in any of these organizations, 35% of them are on 2 or more boards. That's 3,200 people. 3 or more boards, 18%. 4 or more boards, 9%. 5 or more boards, 4.3%. Now, you'll notice there just in passing that it drops by half about each time, from 35 to 18 to 9 to 4. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the power elite. The power elite probably consists of 9,000 to 10,000 people in 2,500 to 3,000 organizations. It has a sort of an inner circle of 3,000 to 3,500 are real active, and maybe 1,000 who in any given year are very, very active. They are the big wheels, they are the spokespersons on TV, and so on and so forth. Well, we can find a lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of it and more, in a first chapter that I wrote for a book with 11 other authors for the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Who Rules America, which is also another reason I'm so glad to be here, because it is the 50th year the book has been out there. And this book is called Studying the Power Elite, 50 Years of Power Structure Research. Now in closing, I'd like to end with an ode to power structure research that may fit with a familiar tune that some of you may know, especially if you ever listen to oldies. And it's spoken with, or I can't quite sing, or I'd sing it for you, and a band behind me, the whole thing. And I close with this because it's the hope that power structure research can become a legacy of sociology when my generation is long gone and not a relic. And it says, it's a great line from this song called Old Time Rock and Roll. It says, call me a relic, call me what you will, say I'm old-fashioned, say I'm over the hill. Today's research ain't got the same soul. I like that old-time rock and roll. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to entertain questions.
Okay, what we're going to do is set this up here, and if you have questions, you can come up to the mic.
Now, apologies in advance if I don't hear you, and I'll need a translator, but the higher your pitch, the tougher it is with my particular hearing problem, which is I'm going to hear you through a Bluetooth. And as I was telling Thea, if I'd been invited to do this 3 years ago, I'd say I'd love to, but I can't, because I couldn't hear anybody in a room like this. There's so much background noise. But now I think I can hear you. But if I don't, and you'll forgive me, I'll have somebody with a deeper voice translate. The only danger with that is, I once did this and I said to the person, how'd that work? And they said, it worked pretty well, except when the one woman gave asked her question. The guy that translated it and told it to you, he just asked his own question. So I may or may not answer your question. Okay, anybody want to ask me a question? Well, feel free to eat.
What?
Right, the mic.
Okay. I'm curious, what sort of methodological dilemmas did you face while doing your research?
Methodological dilemmas are not really our problem. Our problem, we know what to do. We're doing, in today's terms, we're doing network analysis, which is totally okay, and we're doing content analysis. And content analysis has a storied history. It's been used to study newspapers. It's been used to study speeches. It's been used to study all kinds of documents. And it can be really done well now when you have the document, on a searchable form, and you can create these amazing results. So our problem is getting the documents and getting the information. So to give you then a methodological kind of problem we face is that when I was first doing this in the 60s, we were able to, the people that basically are in the power elite are a subset of the people in a book that was called Who Rules America. And in Who Rules America, Who's Who, as other Freudian slip, there was a set of volumes called Who's Who in America that came out every year. And in there, it's exactly, it's a presentation of self in our term. Because you're asked, if you're asked to be in Who's Who, you're asked, what clubs are you in? What schools you go to? So on. In those days, they'd list their prep school, they'd list their clubs, etc. And we had a lot of social club lists. So what could I do? I could then compare, say, the alumni of St. Paul's, which I did, and the members of the Bohemian Club. I could compare them with the Who's Who. And I could see how many mentioned them. And then I could do my little compensation, right? 1 in 3 mentioned their school, so we'll just up by 3, and 1 in 4 mentioned their club, we'll up by 4. No, we could do all really nice quantitative stuff. What happened is, because in the 70s, the activists went after these people that were in exclusionary clubs, which first of all meant they were all anti-Semitic clubs, something that's now history, but it certainly was upsetting to the American Jewish Committee and American business people who were part of these corporate boards but not allowed in those clubs and were hazed viciously at prep school. And so people started to bring that up in hearings and say, if you're going to be an attorney general under Carter, you're going to have to quit the Piedmont Driving Club. He didn't want to quit that club. He just hated the thought. Well, what happened was people stopped listing their clubs. So there's a declining listing of clubs, a declining listing of prep schools, and people aren't giving us social club lists anymore. That's the kind of dilemmas that we face. If we had all the archival documents, all the, every list that's available on time, we'd be set. What that means is, that doesn't mean we're done. It means you've got to do some historical research sometime. And so what I'm doing now, when I can't run around and interview people and do all kinds of other things in retirement, the internet is so amazing. You can go on something called Archive Grid. Just put in Archive Grid, and you go there, and it's a search engine for every major archival library in the United States. And you put in Joe Blow, and if Joe Blow has papers at some library or is mentioned in somebody's papers, you got it. And then you write to that library and you say, would you send me file X? And they say, it costs you $100. And you say, do it. And that's compared to flying there, staying over the night, being in an archive that's only open from 9 to 5, You know, it's incredible. So my current research is a do-over. It's a do-over of what I wrote for the 60s through the 2000s by going through all these archives, and then I can do my own self-correction. But we don't have methodological difficulties in my mind. We just have a few things, like when I mentioned centrality. There's no proof that centrality in these networks equals power, right? And things like that. So there are methodological things, but they're not for tonight. Any other people want to ask me a question? There's somebody.
If I understand you correctly, this is a single power structure. My observation is that the country, the world, is really made up of many specific power structures, be they regional or industry specific or special.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
I deal with that by saying, first of all, I partly agree with you in this way. Within that network, and I didn't have time to do anything but overview it, within that network there are what I call corporate moderates and ultra-conservatives. And they do battle all the time within these meetings with rival think tanks. I mentioned this American Enterprise Institute. The ultra-conservatives were convinced that the Brookings Institution was a liberal institution, and Nixon even said that, and he sent guys to raid their papers and stuff like this. I mean, it was amazing. So some very extreme right-wingers started these kinds of organizations. They're still on the periphery, much more than the news media think, but they're there. And they fight in Congress. And if I had time, I'd give a whole lecture on power elite in the Congress, because there's basically a couple or three coalitions within Congress that are led by corporate people, and I've left out also the Southern rich. The Southern rich are absolutely crucial. First of all, the plantation capitalists, when there were such, they had their own thing, and they weren't as rich. In a certain way, they weren't as economically powerful. But they were in a way twice as powerful than people I've been talking about, because they had a hold on Congress, because they didn't let anybody vote. It was even more elite. There were no rivals in terms of liberal or labor. And they controlled all the congressional committees. And what happened was, and that yet the liberals are in Congress through the Democrats, as are the local growth machines. So what happened was, on every issue that had to do with class, that's a big assertion, but maybe it'll get you to read this stuff. Every issue that had to do with class from 1939 was stopped cold by what was called the Conservative Voting Coalition. That was a majority of Southern Democrats voting with a majority of Republicans, and they stopped everything. Now, that doesn't exist anymore. You know why? Because the conservative Southern Democrats are all Republicans, and the Republican Party is, gotten more and more and more and more conservative. And I have no doubt that the corporate moderates would prefer the Democrats, except for one thing: they're not joining anything that might help labor. Their number one issue is controlling labor markets. Unions are a big threat in their mind. It also creates ideological hysteria, I think. I think they're human and they can get a little crazy. And so until unions are out of the picture, they will never fully become Democrats. But if you look at who passed, say, Obamacare, it was Democrats, and yet it's a very Republican set of strictures is our Obamacare. Now, I am not knocking it for that, but the point is, the principles that back Obamacare, mandates and all, they are totally acceptable to the Business Roundtable and all the group I talked about, and they have written to that effect before Obama was in office. So there's different coalitions now that pass different legislation, and it is very, in that sense, very complicated. But this is the big power structure, and then you can fill it in. Now, you also mentioned, specific industries. Yes, that's the special interest process. That's where they make sure that they get the break for their drug company or their steel company or whatever. That works at a lower level. This level I've been talking about, the policy planning network, is just not looked at by historical institutionalists or anybody else, and yet we have done case studies, but they won't look at them. I mean, I could say to you, well, you read this, and you'll say, oh, sure, but you won't. So that way there, you don't have to disagree with us, you don't have to challenge us, you don't have to put us in your, write an article on why I disagree on the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So I think we got them. Obviously I've said that tonight, but it'll take a while. It took 25 years for O'Connor and Eric Wright to write what I read to you. So it takes a while to admit you're wrong. And have I ever been wrong? Yeah. And in 1990, I wrote a book. I listed many of my mistakes. So I'm very careful about that I've named all my mistakes if I'm going to say, hey, you guys ain't admitting to your mistakes. But anyway, and then the local level, you mentioned or implied, look, there's a whole different power structure at the local level, and I realized I wouldn't have time to talk about tonight. Local level is not about the kind of corporations we're talking about. It's about people. This is strange. They are about people that have only one interest in life, and that's intensifying the use of land. They want to make that land more valuable. And if it's San Francisco, there'll be gay developers. And if it's some other city, there'll be right-wing developers. I mean, those become symbolic issues to them. So we could say the real estate interests dominate the local level, and they're even rivals with corporations because corporations are not loyal to localities. They'll move on in a minute and move to Mexico, Taiwan, China now. So these cities have been left broken by these big corporations. Plus the cities compete with each other. If I can get the University of California at Santa Cruz, there was a fight to get that campus that saved that city. And one of my grad students and I, a great guy named Rich Gendron, who wrote a book called Leftmost City. It's not controlled anymore by the growth machine, but the growth machine brought Santa Cruz there, and then the students and the faculty and all voted against them, and the environmentalists. So sometimes at the local level, others rule. But you can understand if you look at it historically. So I think there's a tremendous amount of conflict in our system, or our rivalries, but 3 or 4 issues: unions, regulation, lower taxes, etc., are their bottom line issues, and that on those you can list. I can list where do the corporate moderates and the ultra-conservatives agree, and where do they disagree, and how do they change. So the ultra-conservatives used to hate trade. They hated trade. And they were isolationists. They didn't like the big military budget. Now they do. And they better, because that was key. Oh, they hated agricultural subsidies. But if you're going to make book with Southern rich, you've got to be for agricultural subsidies. So you don't hear Republicans anymore complaining about agricultural subsidies. In fact, George W. Bush, the fairly recent president, he put through the biggest and longest subsidy program for agriculture that ever was. So they changed their views. And some things have priorities. Other questions? How about student questions? You can ask questions. What the heck? You can say, I haven't read this, but it doesn't sound right for this reason. Okay, next question, though. Here comes one.
Hello. Hi. So what new directions do you foresee?
Pardon me?
What new directions do you foresee this research taking?
What new directions does this research take?
Oh, do you foresee it taking in the future?
What did she say for sure? Did you say what she said? Yeah.
What new directions?
What'd she say?
What new
What new
directions?
directions?
What new directions do you think this will take in the future?
The power structure or the research?
The research.
Oh, the research. I think the research has a fighting chance because it's been very useful, and I just skimmed this very fast, to the environmentalists and to the people who study climate. And so sociologists who study climate, they often refer to this, run it through this network. And they looked at it first, it's interesting, they looked at it as, they looked at the climate denialist network. And that's made up, of course, of all the right-wingers in the power structure. But then they started to look at the other parts, and a young sociologist named Eric Bonds at St. Mary Washington University in Virginia, he looked at the whole range of think tanks and looked at, whether they had climate positions. And then he studied the ones that had climate positions. And sure enough, not only were these ultra-conservatives, but then there were a set of people that said, basically, look, climate change is reality, how are we going to make money? Like, what are we going to do in Alaska to really cash in? And maybe control some of it too. And then a few, these foundations say, we got to take this much more seriously. So he's able to show you the range of opinion, and then we can see who's going to win out on this. And right now, all the major corporate guys think that, the Trump wing is stone cold nuts on climate. And they're pushing their views, and they're turning their experts loose, and they're speaking harshly against it, and so on. So I think it's it's been useful in those specific kinds of situations. So if you are involved in a more practical kind of research, and if you're a middle range theorist and empiricist too, I think eventually you'll end up bumping into this particular network. I'll end an anecdote on that, and that is Eric Bonds, in his research, he also cited another sociologist. And he said, your networks seem to be very similar to the policy planning network that power structure researchers talk about it. And the person wrote back and he said, yeah, it is. He said, I just really hadn't paid enough attention to those, but I'm going to do so in the future. So he didn't even know about this. So it's still got a chance, but I still think it's on the ropes too. That's what the title of my talk is. This could be relic.
All right, let's give Bill one more round of applause.
My pleasure. Okay, that's good.
All right, Ed, are we ready for dinner? Would you like to start with the tables in the back?
There's a cash bar.